Welcome all to this webinar. I look forward to present this presentation to you, answer your Q&A in the next 45 minutes to 50 minutes. Yes, I said my name is Frederick, so all welcome. For those people who can't hear or see me or hear me, please connect with the audio button on the WebEx application. Thanks. So a small introduction to organizational design, as I said. What is organizational design? Well, you will find that many companies have an OD department, and when we speak about OD, then often we talk about organizational design or an organizational development. So what is actually the difference between organizational design and development? Just to get this issue of semantics out of our way before we continue on the presentation. Well, I'd like to always explain the difference between organizational design and development by just referring to the analogy of cars. If you would Google for pictures like I did on this slide, you will see that you will have the ability to see, and there's some people saying they don't hear. No, the buttons are on. You should all hear me. The thing is that if you will look at the analogy of cars, you will see that if you start Google, as I did, find pictures of cars in the design mode. If you would go Google for pictures of cars on the development mode, you will see a complete different type of pictures. In the first case, you will see people being creative, thinking about the future, thinking about different approaches of how should cars look like on the roads in a few years from now. Futuristic sometimes, and first, most of all, elegant, nice to look at. But they also tell you a bit about how the future might look like in terms of the technology available and so on. So designing a car is really using your creative brain and trying to understand how the future will look like. And that's also in the case for designing organizations. We design organizations for the future. When we're talking about developing organizations, well, the same analogy goes for a car. The moment we start looking at developing, we're thinking about fixing, we're thinking about replacing, we're thinking about, well, different aspects of developing a car or an organization. It's really about the systems, the processes, and very often the people as well. It's about developing them, hiring them, fixing them in the sense of getting them on the right path, managing their performance. There's many aspects of development. Organizations are in the first of all about people, and that's where also organization development often focuses on as well. So today we're going to focus on the design part. So when we're talking about the design part, we will talk actually about the aspect of, and that's where also another discussion goes around, is about organizational structures. So what are structures? Well, going back to the design of organizations about the future, we're always trying to convey our message by showing something visually. And that visual part is often the structure. Now, the structure is then, in that sense, the end result of your design exercise. It's not the beginning. It's actually the end result of being creative, thinking about the future, asking questions about what will be the purpose of that organization for the future. It's thinking about what would be the path to that future, what would be the constraints, aspects of regulatory issues or issues related to non-availability of infrastructure or any other type of resources, or even not being able yet to implement it because the technology is not supporting you yet. So these questions is that you're going to ask when you go look into design in an organization. And the most important question you ask yourself first is the question, why? Why do you want to have a redesign of your organization? What is the redesign needs analysis that you want to execute, and why you want to execute that? The first question is why. The moment you have a good question on the question why, and we need to think about that question why, and also think about who will be the stakeholders we're going to ask that question. We also will have to ask a question about what are we actually want to change in this organization. So it's the scoping aspect, and ultimately the last question, because to achieve the objective, to have that design implemented, is the question. On that question, how? to the aspect of development and organizational development. So there is a link, of course, between organizational design and organizational development. What are the factors, the elements that help you to design an organization? Well, there's multiple aspects that actually lead to the analysis, help you to do the analysis of an organization, and that's what we call the organizational design factors. Now, these factors over time have grown and become more complex. I always like to tell the story that organizational design always started at the time of the Egyptians, and it could be true or not, as would French fries be Belgian or French. The question is about what are the factors for design. Now, in the ancient times, power and geography were often one of the factors for designing organizations, factors for design. But the more and more we go into second and third industrial revolution have brought things like processes and systems, machines and automation. And so these models that we have today in place, and I just want to show in this presentation a few of them, is that these system models or design models have actually tried now today to help us to bring the different factors into relationships and to show them what are the relations between these different factors in an organizational design diagnosis, but also having tried to identify the relevant factors for design. So if you look at McKinsey, Halbraith, but also the others like Nadler and Weisbord and Burke-Litwin, you will find that often these models have very similar factors that relate to design. One of the most common ones will be process, another one will be system, one will be around people, and people is a very important factor in designing organizations. Ultimately, we'll see that these different models all apply different approaches, but all have also similar factors. Now, there is also a bit of an issue with these models. As I said, these models have been developed from the 60s onwards, 70s, 80s, 90s, and even some of these models have been redesigned, updated, refreshed, like, for example, Halbraith's STAR model. And ultimately, what we notice that we are always trying to catch up with different factors that come into place that start to become more relevant in nowadays organizational design efforts. So these models definitely have value. They are very useful for starting organizational design practitioners. But also, I would say there is a bit of a warning here that we need to make sure that we actually capture all the relevant factors for an organizational design. So how do we do that? Well, here we go. I think that's where we move from a small introduction to a bit deeper into the organizational design practice. One of the things we need to understand, as I said, is that the organizations have grown together with society. And moving from the first to the third industrial revolution, we have seen also that the complexity of organizations have grown. More complexity due to also different factors that define how an organization is designed. In the first and second industrial revolution, we found automation, mechanics and automation, but also process as an important introduction to organizations. But if you move into the third, and definitely now in the fourth industrial revolution, we will see that we will find different organizations again are being affected by what factors define them, and computerization, digitalization, and so on is definitely something that has been put organizations into a challenge. So when looking, and I'm hoping, are you again not hearing me? Here around, seeing everybody, I think it's fine. So just to pause, sorry for that. So I muted myself again. No, yes, all is good here. Okay, fine, perfect. So we continue. So different factors, as I mentioned. So in organizational design models, we need to start looking at opportunities to add new design factors. And these design factors are related to digitalization, are related to computerization, and so on. And I think even the aspect of human becomes more and more important, more than, for example, the process as a factor for organizational design. But I'll explain that in a minute. So when we're talking about designing organizations, as I said, we need to look at factors. And I like to talk about factors whenever I talk about design organizations. And a good analogy, again, I like my cars, is basically the analogy of the Jeep. So whenever you would, for example, design a car, you think at factors such as environment, yeah, regulations, but also aspects that can restrain you of choosing for certain designs. And the same goes for example, if you would design a Jeep for the moon. An example we like to give in our courses is what would be wrong with this picture. Now, what's wrong with this picture is that you'll probably realize that the way the engine has been designed won't work for that environment. Yeah. Also, the person that has to utilize that car, due to circumstance and environment, will not fit in that car. And it's exactly how design factors work as well. And so whenever we want to design an organization, it is for us very relevant that we are approaching a certain process of designing. So when we talk about the previous models, like those of McKinsey and Harvard, they're very useful in terms of the diagnosis, using the factors that they have defined. Thinking also as an organizational design practitioner to add another few factors that might be relevant for your organization. But more importantly is also to talk about the process of designing organizations. And here are a few steps that we could think about. If you talk about empathization, is really having the understanding, ask the question why and have an answer by the stakeholders of why you need to change in the organization. It's also have a clear definition. But ultimately, it's also about making sure that you design organizations that work for people. Yeah. So the whole aspect of human centricity, customer centricity, and employee centricity become very, very prominent in nowadays practices in organizational design. So when we're thinking about what would be the process or the methodology for designing organizations, for the last few years, I have been a strong advocate of using design thinking. Because design thinking helps us actually to think about the design of an organization from a human context and from a people context. It also offers you the opportunity to answer questions related to how I build agile organizations. Because there goes design thinking in line with agility and lean. And so whenever we approach that organization design from that perspective, from that methodology, we find that actually organization design becomes a very fun activity, and also an activity that interacts with all the stakeholders in a very effective and productive way. So also design thinking and also organizational design thinking, or thinking about the design of organizations, requires a mindset, a modern mindset, I would say an actual mindset. And the mindset, first of all, is that it has to focus on human values, it has to focus on people. Often we have seen in the past, and I would be probably also been in that generation where we talked about organizations, we talked about positions and structures. Nowadays, when we talk about organizations, and definitely agile organizations, we're talking about the human aspect of that organizational design. We also have the importance, we need to have the mindset of showing what we want to tell, and not just tell, but also be able to present, to prototype, to show how future organizations would look like. And that's also part of organizational design. We also like to embrace experimentation, test new ideas. We'd also be very interested to be mindful of the process, of the way we would like to design, and design thinking definitely offers you that. And of course also, I think radical collaboration and crafting, also clarity is an important mindset. In general, this may sound all buzzwords, but I would say human centricity, creativity, thinking about the future, asking the question why, collaborate, are really the mindsets for a good organizational design practice. Now, people ask often also, where do we start with organizational design? Well, I believe that it should always start where the human is in the center of your exercise, and that's in the desire of things. It's really to have that empathization with people and stakeholders, and try to deep and have the insights of what is the desire, why is the desire there. Yeah. And ultimately, whenever we want to improve and make our organizations more effective, we also look at the viability and the feasibility of organizations. But I don't think it will start with feasibility. I always like to start with desire. And that's one of the also I would say lessons I'd like to give here in this webinar is that we always should start where the human starts, is with the desire and the passion. Yeah. So when we talk about organizational design, often we get questions related to, is organizational design something you do here in the Middle East and then you just export it? Often we would say we import Western thoughts about methodologies for doing certain things, so doing things. And so organizational design is one of these do things that we imported. But I feel that from my 15 years experience as an organizational design practitioner, that understanding the cultural threads, the religious threads, the regional threads is very important, because you remember when I spoke about the factors. So the environment is definitely a very important factor. And what drives desire and passion is also related to our culture, to our religion, and so on. So when we have our course in organizational design, definitely we touch the cultural threads. And I think that's a very important talk that we have, and really we spent enough time on this. So if we talk about having organizational design in practice in your organization, well, here we go. We will talk about, of course, an important aspect of communication. Organizational design is not something that you do behind your laptop in your room somewhere in a back office. No, you do that actually in your community, in your organization, in your department. There is also a need for cultural competence, especially in a world of diversity and inclusion. It's important that we understand the organization from a cultural perspective. I think definitely, and that's part of communication and cultural competence, it is also about collaboration and creativity. So it links strongly to the mindset that we just described a few minutes ago. Of course, critical thinking, and that goes along with the question of setting the why question forward. Be critical in that sense also, and go through a process of thinking, and where I suggest using design thinking to actually go and design organizations, and ultimately the aspect of the character as well. So I'm reaching a bit the last 20 minutes of this presentation. Before we go into Q&A, definitely this is a webinar that is giving you a bit of an introduction on how we see organizational design within CIPD, how I see organizational design as a boxologist, and as an advisor and a consultant and a keynote speaker and as a writer. Definitely also when we talk about OD, the focus always has been in our courses to focus on the GCC. So for those who have not been able yet to participate in our courses, I'd like to invite you on the 1st or 3rd of October or the 16th to 18th of December during the OD course. And also we'll put some dates forward, because we're bringing also the International Advanced Awards in Organizational Design Development to the Middle East, and the dates will be announced as well. So don't forget definitely to subscribe